But I am genuinely excited, Kanthi, because it's, as you know, it's a subject I'm passionate about. Cross-cultural awareness, global understanding of what's happening, how each country reacting to the COVID situation and what's happening next would be fascinating to share. So tell me, if we go down this wonderful list that we've got, and I know you're working in all of these continents, tell me a little bit about South America. What's your experience of what's happening there in terms of the countries you're working in?
Okay, well, I'm working in a range of countries, number of Hispanic countries like Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and I'm also coaching people in Brazil. So it's a big mixture. Right now, the way that COVID-19, the pandemic, is rolling out is different in all those different countries. And also the way that it's being approached, as we're discovering in Europe, is also very different by country, by region. There are all sorts of other issues involved, such as the distance that people travel to work is much, much further. There's all sorts of issues around infrastructure, energy, not being able to get on the internet in the same way. There's, the expectation that people will work from home isn't as easily accepted. So therefore it's slightly a miss.
Yeah, and this is fascinating for me because based in Europe as we are, if you don't work in South America, or you never have, some of those logistical challenges wouldn't really resonate as an issue. Tell me about Brazil, Kanthi. What's happening in Brazil?
It's very concerning in Brazil. There's huge denial. There's sort of a huge groupthink that it's a big issue. There's a lot of illness and there's a lot of disconnection between people. So people are really not sure what's going on, but there are high mortality, death rates. There's kind of, at the government level, there's a lot of denial, and Brazil was in trouble before in terms of the economy. So this is making things much harder all round.
And my experience of working in Brazil, and it's all remote now, but I get a mood of being really subdued, and it's so un-Brazilian. It's such a wonderfully exuberant nation normally, and it's subdued. My customers that I speak to are feeling pretty down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was earlier looking up ways of presentation in different cultures. And in Brazil, it's sort of informal, talk about football, all of those things. All of that's missing right now. It really is.
Big miss, isn't it? And so I know this will seem a bit strange, but I'd like to go through a number of countries on our journey quite quickly. Okay. What about Argentina? What's happening in Argentina?
Again, I mean, Argentina had economic problems beforehand. There's a very sort of strict division of labor. There's a lot of labor that travels into the city. People are now home-based. There's the issue where home management has defaulted to women on the whole.
Really?
And because a lot of the workforce and sort of people who help around the house are all back in their houses. So I've heard a number of employers having problems because the females in their workforce are being sidetracked on managing households as well. So that's interesting.
Very interesting dynamic. Would you say that's true in other Spanish-speaking countries in South America, like Chile? I know you're doing a lot.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And Bolivia too. I've heard that again and again. There's a real big theme to that.
Thank you, because it's triggering so many ideas in my head around how, as a consultant, we might be able, first of all, to understand that dynamic and then potentially to help where we can. So let's move to Asia. Sounds like we're on a very fast flight, doesn't it? Let's move to Asia and talk to me about India. You do a lot of work in India.
Indeed. And there, of course, the situation is very similar, but it's even larger. I mean, there's 1.3 million people. The lockdown happened very swiftly, as a result of which millions of migrant workers were left in the cities, and there the economy, their people are paid on a day rate. So if people aren't getting any income, it's a very scary prospect for people, and they ended up walking home because all the transport was shut down as well. I mean, it's quite a concern. And again, the same issue applied around the male-female thing. Women were then left managing households, and it was even a larger issue in India because there's usually more house help. And also the other interesting change has been that most of the workforce were never geared up to work from home. So people working in offices and call centers have computers, but they weren't at home. You know, they couldn't take them home, and there wasn't the laptops or the infrastructure. So trying to work with mobiles and remotely became a really big issue quite early on.
So that's fascinating, again, because of the cultural difference. And would you say that the pandemic is kind of reinforcing some of the cultural dimensions in countries? Is it exacerbating some of the issues?
I'd say that what's happening is people are going into fear and uncertainty. So it's resorting to type. It's resorting to what was perceived as a comfort zone. So in India, resorting to more hierarchical structures. In South America, there's more tell, there's more machismo. You know, there's a lot of those sort of things going on.
And in terms of India, how economically is the country reacting to the pandemic?
It's in the throes of huge issues this week because there's been a sort of resurgence in Delhi, in particular, Delhi and Mumbai. The country was opening back up again, and business was beginning to resume to some form of normality, but it's all gone on hold again. But again, the Indians as a nation are far more resourceful than many nations. So therefore, they are they're finding solutions to a lot of those issues. I think this is a time-based answer, I think, is really the case here.
Yes, thank you. And I thought it'd be good to talk about China in that sense, because we have a couple of really big clients in China. And one of the things I've noticed is this exactly the point you make around there's a resurgence of the virus in a number of areas. And yet there's a real pragmatism around and resilience actually of the workforce, because they are working. But if in a specific area they need to shut down again, they do that really fast and with real discipline. But there's a lot of energy to work. And so there's a real balance there. Do you have work currently in China?
Not right at this moment. I am in touch. I have several colleagues who are working in China, and so I'm in touch with them, so I can hear what's going on.
Yeah, there's one other country I wanted to mention in Asia, and that's Korea, South Korea. There's tremendous pragmatism as well. I think I'm going to use that word a lot in terms of getting on with things. A superb, loads of our clients at Uspire are in the medical device industry. And there's been a brilliant management within the medical sector of the pandemic originally, of really proper track and trace. And there's a willingness of the people to be quite strict with themselves about physical distancing where appropriate. But there's a lot of work going on. So South Korea doing very well.
Oh, very good.
So Australasia. Let's talk a little bit about Australasia. One of the clients we have in tourism, Big Bus, announced this week that they're opening the Sydney Big Bus Tour as of this Friday, June the 26th, which is really exciting because in terms of hospitality, there isn't much good news out there. So that's a really good piece of news to share. And it's interesting that they are expecting significant, what they call home tourists, which is people from across Australia going to visit the capital that they may, I say the capital, but Sydney is the biggest city. They haven't done before. Equally more tourists are going to the capital, which is Canberra. And so there's an energy in Australia, but also a wariness of increase in, or a return, a second spike. How about you in terms of that region?
How are they managing it in terms of the 1 meter distancing rule and so on in Australia?
Well, it's interesting because they're coming into their winter. And so
Right.
they're saying, my clients are saying that helps because it's cooler. And so that means that it's far less likely that people are going to be out in the streets in large numbers. People wrap
Mm-hmm.
up sensibly at this time of year. So pretty well. And actually business is doing significantly better than most other regions, I would say, in Australia and New Zealand. Very well managed in terms of their governments. And it's going decently well from a business.
Mm. That's good to know because it will start to move back across the seas, won't it?
Yes, you would expect so. So talk to me about Africa. What's your experience?
Yes, and that's been very interesting. I've got coaching clients in North Africa, in French-speaking parts of Africa, as well as South Africa. And there, the infrastructure issues are really exacerbated problems. One of my clients is struggling because his workforce, they're in lockdown. And the workforces are working from home. But working from home, there's no electricity. So that causes even more issues, and the use of telephones isn't as easy either. So in that whole dynamic of communicating with people and trying to get people together is becoming more and more awkward.
And
It's more challenging.
which countries are you working in there?
Um, Guinea, Nigeria, South Africa.
It's very interesting because I've also heard that in some African countries they've maintained complete openness of society
Mm-hmm.
with the mentality that says actually the mosquitoes are killing more people than the virus, so we might as well stay completely open. So Malawi, for example, has that strategy. And so I think by country, again, we're seeing differences, aren't we?
And it's how people interpret it as well. You know, as you know, an interesting, I know we're jumping, but an interesting conversation I had today was around Ireland. I was talking to somebody in Ireland, and one of the big issues there is the fact that masks on public transport are not mandated, because in Ireland people don't mandate things. It's all consensual. It's working as a community. It's working alongside each other. So being mandated, as the UK is, to wear a mask on public transport, it's kind of an unheard of imposition. So the interpretation of guidelines can be very different as well.
Well, let's work on this theme. Let's stay in Europe then. Let's stay in Ireland. What's happening from a business sense in the Irish community? You're often in Ireland or coaching Irish businesses. What's happening now in Ireland?
It's bubbling. It's bubbling along quite nicely. People are waiting. You know, the lockdown and the guidelines are opening up. There's a lot more clarity in Ireland than there seems to be in the UK. There's more. You know, there are guidelines that are easily interpreted, whereas in the UK there's quite a lot of conflict between guidelines on one side and regulation on the other. You know, what's a law and what's a guideline? You know, and that kind of gets lost in the mist. So Ireland is unlocking quite fast. Business seems to be bubbling. There's a lot more. I mean, the Irish are quite eloquent anyhow at the best of times. They're quite good at talking up how business is going as well. So we've had some quite interesting upbeat conversations, which is great.
And one of the roles you play in business of the many, Kanthi, is chairman of the Indian Irish Association. And how is that dynamic, the sort of Ireland overseas perspective? How's that going?
Well, there's not been any flights. I mean, the flights have been so limited. That's really, you know, for an island nation, that's caused all sorts of issues. But as I say, the conversations are quite upbeat. And Ireland's got a strong business relationship with Germany. And I believe you've got quite a lot of connections with Germany. How are you finding Germany at the moment?
That's a very good question, Kanthi. we have 4 active clients who have German teams that we work with. And in terms of European responses, the German market for me is the one that is the most active from a business sense. All 4 of the companies we work with are actively looking for support from us in terms of coaching and training, albeit remotely. And there's also a real eagerness for us to fly over as soon as we can when the air bridge is sorted out.
Yes.
And that's fascinating because, again, there's a real pragmatism in Germany. There's been an outbreak in the northwest, but in the east, I was talking to a client in Leipzig yesterday, and they were saying, we're pretty open here. We're very respectful of physical distancing, but we're getting on with business. So they're being very targeted if there are issues and isolating. But other than that, business is getting on decently well in Germany.
Oh, that's great. I understand it's the same in France. Again, I'm in contact with a number of people in business in France, and things have opened up. The restaurants are opening up. Businesses are beginning to trade again, and that's been going on for a few weeks now. It's not so new as it is here.
Well, this is interesting because in German cities and French cities, you are seeing the cafe culture coming back. It's very respectful. And so there is greater distance. It's at least a meter between tables, 1.5 meters. But there's an energy coming back in France and Germany, certainly, that I've seen. And interestingly, Sweden's an interesting example of a country that decided to, although again, be sensible about distancing physically, they've been open all the way through. So there hasn't been a strict lockdown at all in Sweden. And that's been an interesting strategy from that marketplace. And of course, there is one country in Europe, I believe, had no cases whatsoever of COVID, which is Iceland. And so society is absolutely thriving there. So you go to Reykjavik and it feels completely as though it would have done 4 or 5 months ago.
Gosh, that's exciting. I think it's possible.
Incredible, isn't it?
Yes. What about the States? You spent a lot of time in the States.
Yeah, America is interesting because for all the reasons we understand, we see a lot of images from America. And I think it actually is utterly misrepresentative of the energy that I'm finding working with my US clients. So there's a tremendous generosity at the moment. So the big customers that I have are all focusing on 2 things in my experience. One is, how can we help our community? And the second is, how can we invest in our people to support them through this journey? So very specific examples. Edwards Life Sciences that sponsor this very Boostcast have donated $1 million in the last month to parts of the Americas, particularly Brazil, Puerto Rico, and other parts of their continent that are struggling, in particular to try and get medicines to more people. So this innate generosity is coming out. And another example, Thai Union North America, it's the biggest tuna business in the world, huge fish manufacturing business, is again doing so much work in the community and donating to help. So American business is really stepping up to this situation, and it's really impressive. And of course, it's not reported. What's reported is all the things we see on our daily news, which isn't necessarily a positive thing, and it's certainly not reflective of what's happening at grassroots level.
No, and that is a generalism for the news across the world. In fact, what we're seeing reported is only a small amount of the actual business climate in each of those countries.
So, Kanthi, we've done a whistle-stop tour of 5 different continents. I'd love to focus, as we come towards the end of this discussion, around risk management. So you recently published an article which was wonderful around from crisis to opportunity. And you talked about some key areas like resilience, engagement, but also risk management. What's your insight about how any one of these continents or particular countries is dealing or will deal with risk going forward? What's your sense?
Yes, it's interesting. I coach quite a lot of companies that are upscaling, startups and small businesses. And the whole pandemic risk preparation just wasn't there. And it has put a lot of people into panic. The larger businesses have thought through some of this, but the focus is going very much into COVID-19 and managing post-COVID-19 risk. And I fear that companies will be taking their eye off the ball on what were already existing risks. There are already quite a lot of things going on that they needed to take into account. And I fear that COVID-19 will make them forget that they have other business responsibilities.
So if you were going to give a message to leaders now, and I'm conscious in your excellent book, Performance Edge, you talk about the science of leadership. What advice would you give to leaders now to manage the now, but also to have this vision that you talk about, to understand the wider implications and manage next, not just now?
Well, it does really get back down to communication. Leaders tend to forget that they're so busy thinking about what's going to happen next. They're forgetting about the here and now, what we're doing in the present, how we're communicating with people, how we're engaging with people, how we're trying to take our workforce with us. So by the time they get around to communicating exactly what the next plan is, they've got to get the workforce up to the same level of understanding. So, they'll be going through loss, worry, fear, all of those things. And we need to really try and get them up the curve together. And that gets forgotten. At the moment, people are buzzing, the adrenaline's going, everybody's in sort of reactive mode. But it's really important to take people with you. And the only way you can do that is through personal engagement, which, of course, in this medium becomes quite difficult.
It does, doesn't it? And
yes.
And so, final tip, if you were coaching now a leader, and we have many listening to these Boostcasts, to say if there's one thing you would recommend leaders do to enable their workforce to embrace the opportunity, to use your language, what would that one tip be?
Be really clear about where you want people to head to. Be really clear. I was coaching somebody today, and I kept saying, you've got to be clear about the vision. If you're not clear, how can you expect everybody else to follow you? Because we're humans. We'll make up what we think's the right thing to do, as opposed to where we should be going. So we'll just have a completely dysfunctional group of people all doing their best.
Yeah, that triggered with me, because we did a clarity test as a business. So a good friend of ours, Anthony Willoughby, asked us a number of clarity questions. How clear are you about the following? Right, now you're clear, communicate it to your team. And I think that's the essence of what you've just said, really, isn't it?
Yes.
I think it's been a great, very fast trip around the world. So thank you so much for sharing your insight about each of the countries. And what I'm hoping is that people who've not traveled to some of the countries you've mentioned are now even more curious than they were before we even started. Learn and find out more.
Indeed, because there is huge opportunity out there. It's just making the right connections.